The day after his inauguration on January 20th of 1961, President Kennedy asked his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to head a task force to assess the feasibility of a Peace Corps. 1 month later, Shriver delivered the report to the president on the Peace Corps, and on March 1st, JFK signed Executive Order 10924, which established the agency on a quote unquote temporary pilot basis. Volunteers selected for Columbia arrived at Rutgers on June 25th, and training officially began the next day at 8 a.m. on June 26th. The legislation that established the Peace Corps on a permanent basis, the Peace Corps Act, was signed by President Kennedy on September 22nd, 1961. On the day JFK signed the act, 3 groups of volunteers were already in their countries of service: Colombia, Ghana, and St. Lucia. A quote that John Kennedy shared on that day when he signed, I believe either on March 1st or September 22nd, he said, "For every young American who participates in the Peace Corps, who works in a foreign land, will know that he or she is sharing in the great common cause of bringing to men that decent way of life, which is the foundation of freedom and a condition of peace. Now, when billions of people around the world continue to face conflict, poverty, disease, and the erratically changing climate, that great common cause is more urgent than ever." Peace Corps is arguably America's most effective grassroots program for human development and cross-cultural bridge building, and its return on investment is unmatched. I'd like to recognize those special guests joining us this morning. Mr. Bill Josephson, the architect of the Peace Corps. In late 1960, with a State Department colleague, Mr. Warren Wiggins, Mr. Josephson co-authored The Towering Task, a paper that captured the imagination of Sergeant Shriver and contributed directly to the design and scope of Peace Corps. Mr. Josephson continued to work with Sergeant Shriver at the Peace Corps until 1966, holding positions as Special Assistant to the Director and then General Counsel. He was in the Oval Office that day. Mr. Bill Moyers, joining us today, joined Sergeant Shriver on meetings on Capitol Hill to make sure the Peace Corps was supported by our members of Congress. He was first appointed as Associate Director of the Public Affairs for the newly created Peace Corps in 1961, and subsequently served as Deputy Director from 1962 to 1963. Later, of course, he served in the White House as Press Secretary to President Johnson. I want to note that Bill Moyers told me he was 26 years old that day. Imagine. I'd like to thank Mr. Moyers and Mr. Josephson in particular for their role in pioneering and championing the establishment of the Peace Corps. I am one of 240,000 Americans who are very grateful to them for their role in creating the Peace Corps, so that all of us have had the opportunity to serve in this capacity. Thank you so much, Mr. Moyers. Thank you very much, Mr. Josephson, for your leadership and all that you've done for the Peace Corps. And I'd also like just to introduce a special guest with us as well today. She's not really a guest to us because she works with National Peace Corps Association as an advocacy associate. Miriam Foote represents the future of the Peace Corps. She was serving in Benin when she was evacuated in 2020 last year, began working with National Peace Corps Association shortly after that, and really has provided tremendous leadership in helping make the Peace Corps the best that it can be through her work in advocacy outreach. She is a 2021 Donald Payne Fellow in International Development at USAID and is pursuing through that program her Global Human Development Master's degree at Georgetown University. I'd like to thank Miriam for all that she's done with National Peace Corps Association and in the Peace Corps community for her leadership role in helping make the Peace Corps the best that it can be for future generations. Finally, I'd like to introduce here Congressman Joe Kennedy, who has served his country well as a member of Congress from Massachusetts District 4 from 2013 to 21. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic from 2004 to 2006. And while in the House of Representatives, he was a champion for the Peace Corps, always fighting for the Peace Corps' budget and helping us to move the appropriations along, also introducing and championing the legislation for the Peace Corps commemorative, and championing civil rights, climate change, and racial inequality and healthcare issues that were so important to not only our community, but to our country. And he has served us well in our Peace Corps community. I'm so grateful for all that he has done. He's now working on Project Groundwork, which is boosting local community organizing efforts throughout the United States for voters and voter registration. So with that, I'd like to pass the microphone here to Congressman Kennedy, thank you for joining us this morning, Congressman Kennedy. Thank you to all of you who joined us this morning, and enjoy the program.
Glenn, thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for the honor of joining you. And I just want to take a quick moment and pause. It is 9:45, which is the exact moment 60 years ago when President Kennedy signed the Peace Corps Act into law. So congratulations, everybody. And Glenn, thank you for pulling so many people together and making this available for the broader Peace Corps community, and take a moment and celebrate, reflect, and rededicate ourselves to the mission and purpose and commitment for the Peace Corps. So I'm incredibly honored and thrilled to be here with you. I appreciate everybody's patience this morning as we get underway here. Our calendars are now a little bit off, but I'm going to do my best to readjust here on the fly, because we have an incredible program, and from folks that obviously not just have been committed to Peace Corps, but committed to an organization and helped set it up and start it and navigate it through the legislative process to actually make it a thing, and then preserve and protect that commitment and that legacy going forward. So Mr. Josephson, it is an absolute honor for me to engage in this conversation with you. We are thrilled and honored that you are here and have made the time to join us today. I wanted to get going, just kind of walk us through a little bit of those early days, because you have been, you were an architect of the law. You were there at the earliest moments when this was an idea, and taking an idea and translating that into actual legislative text, legislative effort to a congressional, or excuse me, a liaison effort to actually get members of Congress and the House and Senate around it, and then stand this thing up is not an easy thing to do. So tell us a little bit about that, walk us through it. And I know I would love to hear some of those stories.
A brief tribute to my colleague, Warren W. Wiggins. Warren had served in the Marshall Plan in Norway, in the Philippines in mutual security, in Bolivia in mutual security, and in AID Washington. When he became Deputy Director of the Far East Region and I became counsel to the Far East Region in ICA, we bonded. At the time of President Kennedy's election, Warren, who was one of the most creative and resourceful people whom I've ever known, said that we needed to make an impact with this administration if we wanted to have a future with it. And after a couple of starts with issues involving Vietnam and the reorganization of foreign aid, we settled on the Peace Corps because that was what everyone asked us for our opinion about. And the result was the writing over Christmas and New Year's of 6061 of the Towering Task, and the distribution of it to as many people as we could find who would read it, including Harris Wofford. And Harris describes walking into Sergeant Shriver's office carrying the Towering Task with him and saying to Sarge that this is something he ought to read, only to find that Sarge was already reading it. And my theory has always been that the copy that made it to Sarge was the copy that got to him through the State Department ICA bureaucracy. So we were off and running.
And running you certainly were. So tell me a little bit, sir. There's a great story I've heard about and read about a little bit of kind of some of the chaos and actually getting the bill signed into law, which I think involved you and a number of senators in a cloakroom, some chicken scratch on a piece of paper, to a clerk to retype something up, a couple of taxi cabs, and lo and behold, the Peace Corps was born. So walk us through that story a little bit if you can.
First of all, I'd like to pay a little bit of tribute to Roger Kuhn, who's still alive. Roger was the principal draftsperson of the Peace Corps Act. I was, an important kibitzer, that's for sure, and the upfront person in the House and Senate hearings. But I was very preoccupied, first of all, with getting the executive order through the bureaucracy and getting it signed by the president by March 1. I was also exceedingly active in preparing the congressional presentation documents and in briefing the witnesses for the various Senate and House hearings. Roger really carried the laboring oar on the statute, including, for example, the incredibly technical negotiations with Treasury and House Ways and Means on how the tax treatment of volunteer readjustment allowances and other payments would come out. But ultimately, we had a bill, and the bill went up to the Hill without a lot of changes from the White House or the Budget Division, and was introduced by Hubert Humphrey in the Senate and the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Doc Morgan of Pennsylvania, in the House, and the hearings began. One story that I want to tell has to do with the fact that this was a genuine bipartisan effort. I'm not 100% certain that could take place again today, but we enjoyed very, very strong support from both the Republicans in the Senate and the Republicans in the House. I particularly remember two women on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Marguerite Stitt Church of Illinois and Elizabeth Bolton of Ohio, very strong Republicans, traditional Republicans, and amazingly strong and persuasive supporters of the Peace Corps.
Mr. Moyers, I'd love to bring you in to this now. I know you were incredibly involved in those early days with Sergeant Shriver as well, and the engagement effort and the lobbying effort with both chambers on the Hill in getting this done. I'd love to get your thoughts on this and tell us a little bit about how you were able to get such a big idea through Congress, where at the moment, obviously, big ideas are difficult to get through, to put it mildly.
Well, it's good to see you, and it's good to hear my colleague and beloved friend, Bill Josephson, and to be with so many of you around the country whom I cannot see, but whose presence I can feel, because there remains to this day, 60 years later, a certain vibrancy among people who were involved in the Peace Corps, the volunteers who went abroad, those of us backing them up here at home, and those of you who've come later. It's really been a marvelous moment in American history, a moment whose time has come. Lord knows so many people had talked about something like this from the beginning. In fact, in 1950, Walter Reuther, the head of the Auto Workers of America, had proposed a kind of tech corps of young people who would go abroad. He referred to it over and over again. Morris Albertson, who had done pioneering work in academic studies in mechanics and hydraulics, wrote a draft of a .4 youth program. Hubert Humphrey had introduced the first bill in 1957, and he said it got no enthusiasm, but he was one of our main floor leaders in the Senate in the passage of it. I mean, Reverend James Robertson of Crossroads America had founded that program with an eye that could have well been on a future Peace Corps. This idea was an American idea who rose among the ranks of people who did not hesitate to call themselves idealists, but knew how to pass bills in Congress, and that made a big difference. It was truly a moment in which those of us who shared in it still tremble at the thought of, and those of you who followed up to implement it deserve our greatest respects. Sarge gave me the job of Associate Director for Public Affairs. That meant I had three portfolios. One, congressional relations. Two, public affairs, press and advertising, and then recruiting. We'll cover all of those, I'm sure, this evening. But when Bill Josephson and Warren Wiggins and those who helped them draft the legislation, and I'm going to use a perverse term here, declared war or peace, they sent Sarge and me up to the Hill to sell it. And we had to persuade a Congress that contained many advocates of the Peace Corps, but also some real opponents. We first called on a handful of our friends, Hubert Humphrey, Congressman Roos from Wisconsin, who had proposed a Peace Corps along with his colleague in the Senate, Hubert Humphrey. We went to them first because obviously we wanted our friends to stand and fight for us right through the thick and thin. And of course, they signed on very quickly. They were enthusiastic. We didn't have to spend a lot of time with them, although we had to bring Bill up and others to explain the technical aspects to some of them and their staff so that they could keep working on this legislation, even as Sarge and I prowl Capitol Hill. We decided to call on every member of Congress. And I think we made it with the exception of one by the time it was all over. Starting with our friends, we then went to the known adversaries of the Peace Corps, those who had declared their opposition to it before they even knew what it was. One of them was a congressman born in 1960, Otto the Terrible Passman. He was literally known as Otto the Terrible because he was so opposed to any foreign aid abroad except that which took a brick bat and tried to hit a communist over the head. He called the Peace Corps a kiddie corps. He got Congressman H.R. Gross, who was an influential conservative from Iowa, on his side, and he called it a utopian playground. So Sarge and I called on, actually I went first to see Otto Passman because I was from the South. He was from a deeply Southern and segregationist district in Louisiana, not too far from my hometown across at the Texas border. I got my congressman, the populist Wright Patman of East Texas, to call Otto the Terrible and say he was sending this kid over to see me, and that I can speak very well for him, said Wright Patman. Just listen to him. So I went over and talked to him first and told him, he said, what do you want to talk to me about? And I said, I just am here to arrange a meeting with a future director of the Peace Corps. I don't want to see any future director of the Peace Corps. I just want to veto the thing when it comes to my desk. I said, well, don't you want to sit down with the president's brother-in-law and talk about this? There was silence. He said, the president's brother-in-law? I said, yes, Sergeant Shriver, who is John Kennedy's brother-in-law, married to Ethel, is going to head the Peace Corps, and he would like to come see you. Well, that was an appeal to Otto, the Terrible, and he saw Shriver, and Shriver knew instantly what to talk to him about because we had done our homework. Otto had been a tightwad all through Congress. We had every vote he had made against every foreign aid appropriations. We knew what to talk about because while he didn't want to hear about the Peace Corps, we wanted to talk to him about what it meant to be an entrepreneur. And when Sarge walked in, he started talking to the congressman about his how he had started a business during the Depression, selling refrigerators and other hotel and home equipment, business equipment. Passman looked at him and said, how did you know that? He said, well, I used to run the merchandise mart in Chicago, Congressman, and we saw a lot of refrigerators and other things like that pass through, and I was just wondering how you managed to do that in the Depression. Well, Otto melted a little, and he gave us a long visit that day, and we probably paid more visits to Otto Passman, who was chairman of the influential Foreign Relations Funding Committee in the House than we did to any other Congress. We never brought him around, but the word spread very quickly that Sarge had given the courtesy of an extended and frequent visits to Otto Passman, and that turned into a lot of goodwill. When the legislation passed, we got some 90 Republican votes in the House, and very few of those who had stood up and condemned it before they knew anything about it protested. They didn't vote for us, but they didn't fight us with tooth and nail as they might have. The legislation, well, as Bill said, was a success. It was changed hardly at all, and it passed the House, I think, 240 Democratic votes and 87 Republican votes, and then it sailed through the Senate after the conference committee met. There was never a better salesman, never a better idealist at explaining what an ideal is than Sergeant Shriver. He could adjust very quickly to the mood, to the dialect, to the interests, and to the concerns of the member of Congress he was speaking to. He and I went up usually every morning from 8 till 10, because Congress convened at 10, and there were votes and there were hearings and there were other meetings. We selectively ticked the names off our list. We didn't just run in, introduce ourselves. We sat down. The congressman and his staff asked questions, and by the time it was over, I don't think there was a program in Washington that had a better aura around it than this one. Of course, we had the president, the young, dynamic president behind us, often speaking when we wanted to. And here was a very important factor. We asked President Kennedy to ask Vice President Lyndon Johnson, for whom I had worked, to be chairman of the Peace Corps Advisory Committee. He had been the director in Texas of Franklin Roosevelt's National Youth the National Youth Program in Texas in 1935, 36, and 37. He had done the best job in the country of all the state directors of the National Youth Corps. It was such a good job that Eleanor Roosevelt paid Texas and Lyndon Johnson several visits during that period of time, because in Washington they were so impressed with what Johnson had done in Texas. Of course, this launched his career in Congress. But Johnson's main aim, I've studied this very carefully, with the National Youth Corps in Texas, each state carried out its own mission, was to try to connect unemployed youth with education. He didn't think it was just enough to have a job, they had to have a future. And he concentrated on that for 2 years while he was the director there. And Johnson really gave us the time we needed. When the State Department and the AID, Agency for International Development, tried to take over the Peace Corps, turned it into just another box on the bureaucratic chart. Bill Josephson can talk about that. We spent 2.5 hours in the Vice President's office, Vice President Johnson, in his office, as he explained patiently to Sarge and me how the bureaucracy worked. He'd seen it for 30 some odd years. Here's what you have to watch out for. Here's how you have to turn the corner without running into somebody. And at 2.5 hours later, we knew what to do when we went and talked about preserving the independence of the Peace Corps, which Josephson and Wiggins had said was so essential. Every time we needed help on the Hill, the Vice President came through. During the campaign of 1960, I had served as the liaison between the two traveling teams. I was on Swoosh 2, named for the president, named for the Lyndon Johnson's airplane he flew on briefly in the Pacific after the Japanese attack, and President Kennedy and his team flew on the Caroline, named for his daughter, his and Jackie's daughter. And my job was to coordinate logistics, to compare speeches, to answer questions, to keep us on track. Every day I was in touch with some member of the traveling Kennedy campaign, and most often with Kenny O'Donnell, who was his closest political advisor, became his more or less chief of staff in the White House. I could get them on the phone, they could get me on the phone, and when it came time for me to want to go to the Peace Corps after the election, both Kennedy and Johnson said no, because who then would interpret Austin to Boston? But I persuaded Ken O'Donnell to persuade President Kennedy to let me go, and that's how I wound up there. It's the best move of my life, and to this day, I'm deeply indebted to JFK and LBJ.
May I share with the panel a little known fact about you? Bill Moyers is actually the drafter of the first public speech favoring the founding of the Peace Corps, even before the Michigan State speech of John Kennedy late at night after a long day of debating and campaigning. But President Johnson gave a speech advocating the creation of the Peace Corps in Lincoln, Nebraska, 2 weeks before the Michigan State experience. And that speech was drafted by Bill Moyers. I know this because my wife is Nebraskan, and she knows about that Johnson event and that speech.
Well, I know about it because the president, through the speech we'd received by wire from the headquarters back in Washington for the speech he was going to deliver at the university that night. We were on the plane. We'd just taken off, I think, from Binghamton, New York, headed for Lincoln, Nebraska. He said, "I can't deliver this stuff. It's crap." He said, write something stirring." And so the proposal he made based on that speech was actually called a youth corps. I wish I had used the word Peace Corps, but that hadn't occurred to me. But it was a great event and promptly lost to history, except for Bill's wife Barbara, who remembers it. But it was a good moment.
I am struck listening to both of you how much the skills that I think made volunteers so successful, that persistence, the patience, the willingness to understand perspectives from a different point of view, listening more than talking, going in with, even if you know where you want to go, understanding that process matters, bringing people on board and letting others take ownership of the idea. All of those are skills that are inculcated to Peace Corps volunteers through that training, and certainly over the course of their service. I often said that there wasn't a single day that went by when I was serving in Congress that I didn't draw on my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer. And that wasn't actually so much the language skills, speaking Spanish, it was just the understanding that if you want to bring people together to actually achieve some sort of common goal, they needed to be active participants in that process, and you needed to help shepherd and create the circumstances to allow people to buy in and hear them out. And so I just, listening to both of you as you talk through these stories with members of Congress or bureaucracy or a president, vice president campaigns, all of that, it strikes me as the central core of what the Peace Corps really is all about and what makes people successful. Mr. Moyers, you mentioned some of these challenges at times of trying to keep the agency independent. That was actually part of the issues that came up even when I was serving in Congress, and an effort to try to subsume this within the State Department, and mention Mr. Josephson's engagement in that process too. I was hoping you both might be able to touch on that. I think probably everybody on the forum here understands how important that is, but I'd be curious your perspective as to why some policymakers didn't, and what was the arguments and how you were able to maintain that independence.
Well, one of the arguments was that the State Department and the to-be-formed, transformed International Cooperation Administration into the Agency for International Development regarded the Peace Corps as a gem, as opposed to what they did, which did not enjoy anything like broad support either in Congress or in the nation. Foreign aid was, and to some extent still is, a stepchild. So they coveted the Peace Corps. And we felt, Sarge and Warren and Bill and I felt that the Peace Corps, in order to succeed, had not to be any part of the foreign affairs bureaucracy or the Cold War programs of the United States. And we strongly advocated that, notwithstanding a presidential special message to Congress on the foreign aid program, which, as a result of our lobbying of Richard Goodwin, waffled on the issue of the future of the Peace Corps, which remained unresolved. And we were desperate to have our legislation transmitted to the Hill, which would establish our independence. And so the legislation was the vehicle for the Peace Corps' independence. There was a climactic meeting in the White House. Bill Moyers wasn't there. I don't know why. Warren was not there. I don't know why. I was there. And also present were Ralph Dungan, who was an important member of the White House staff under President Kennedy, the future director of AID, the director of the budget, David Bell, and me. And we waited to see the president on this issue, but didn't get in. And Ralph purported to resolve the issue against the Peace Corps and in favor of the State Department and the foreign aid program. Bill Moyers then went to the vice president, and the vice president had a private meeting with President Kennedy later that day and persuaded him in the way that Lyndon Johnson uniquely could persuade people to make the Peace Corps an independent agency. Ralph called me the next morning to tell me this decision, and I said, well, I'd like to come over and smoke the pipe of peace with you. You know, we're going to be working together for a long time. And he said very clearly, you know, you wanted to be independent, you're independent. Don't come running to us when you're in trouble. And Bill and I never did.
There's another point to be made, slightly less lofty than that one, which is that you can hardly channel the imagination up an organization chart, nor can the imagination flow downward through an organization chart, because along the way there are other people charged with certain responsibilities and duties that cause them to hack away at that passion in order to reduce it to their grasp. Also, if you want to go up and persuade Congress to support you, you want to go up unencumbered by other people's mistakes and other people's less desirable thoughts. You want to go up and make your case and stand and fall on what you can say about what I, Sergeant Shriver, am going to be responsible for. And if you don't understand this, you can count on me to keep my word to Congress. You know, those powerful barons up on the Congress considered the Peace Corps, those who oppose us, naive, if not harebrained. You couldn't have sent a 25-year veteran of the bureaucracy up there to explain, give a tutorial. Once after I took Sarge up to have coffee one morning with the vice president, Johnson called me later, and this is where he said what I summarized earlier. The way to sell the Peace Corps is to sell Shriver. They won't be able to resist him. And they weren't. They weren't. Most were dazzled to be courted by the president's charismatic brother-in-law, not some long-standing official from the bureaucracy. I'm not damning the bureaucracy, essential to the running of our government. But what turned the tide was not Sarge's glamour, but his passion. I saw jaded politicians begin to pay attention. As Sarge talked about America's revolutionary ideas and our mission to carry them out in the world as down-to-earth, believable, card-carrying idealists who can show how freedom is served by a teacher in a classroom, clean water from a pump in the village square. I mean, this old, unreconstructed racist whose chairmanship of that key subcommittee, Congressman Kennedy, meant life or death to our appropriations. He was aghast that young Americans living and working abroad under official auspices might not only practice miscegenation, but bring it home with them. Only Shriver could answer that, not a Schedule C appointee in the Department of Agency, International and Development. Because when that congressman made the case that if volunteers went abroad, they'd come back and marry interracially, Sarge never blinked. He said, Congressman, you know, surely you can trust young Americans to do abroad exactly what they would do back in your district in Louisiana. And that left the man scratching his head. And when I returned later for a follow-up call, his secretary told me he had confessed, I was had. You can't get that from, bless their hearts, the career people who had so much drained from them by compromise and over the years. It took this man up there making the case and standing, believe in me because I believe in the Peace Corps.
He wasn't the only guy that Sarge was able to win over. I can tell you that much. And he's I'm struck not only by obviously your commentary here and the power of the idea, but the relentlessness and the optimism that its champions demonstrated. And if not for that dedication and that passion and that commitment to those ideas, and in the words of others, the better angels of our nature. I heard Sergeant's son Timmy at a Peace Corps event years ago talk about a story of his dad in East Africa, and off in a Jeep somewhere going off. I think it was in Kenya or Tanzania. And they're driving along, and they ran into some members of some locals walking across part of the I think it was the Serengeti, at least as I recall it. And Sarge ordered them to stop the car, jumped on out, ran right up to him, shook their hands and started talking a million miles an hour. And three other folks that he was talking to looked at each other like I had no idea what Sarge was talking about. But just the engagement, the optimism, the enthusiasm, the willingness to understand at a very base human level the connections that we have, and that foreign didn't mean fear, and that if you are willing to extend your hand in friendship, it would be reciprocated. And one of my great lessons from my time in service, in every country I've ever traveled to, I have yet to find a child where if you throw a ball, they don't pick it up and throw it back. And right. That insight that you all speak to, and the acumen to actually get this done, but I think reinforces that basic observation of the connectivity between all of us. And Mr. Moyers, I think it was some of your writings, I believe, about the fact that Peace Corps experience from different parts of the globe just gives you different viewpoints as to our different perspectives on our planet. And I couldn't agree with you more on that. So we don't have a ton of time left here, given some of the difficulties earlier, but I wanted to close this part of the program just by asking each of you, Mr. Moyers and Mr. Josephson, if there's one thing that the Peace Corps means to you today, given your experience in its conception and its implementation and its development, and looking back on what it has done over the course as an agency, over the course of these 60 years, which I think is safe to say has far surpassed any conception that anybody could have possibly had of it. What does that mean to you?
The essence of the Peace Corps is service. That's a concept that we emphasized over and over again. And you could see it, for example, in the reaction of the University of Michigan students to President Kennedy's off-the-cuff speech. You could see it in the outflow of applications to serve in the Peace Corps that followed the announcement of the Peace Corps. You can see it in what volunteers, now more than 250,000 former volunteers, actually did in service and continue to do in serving those ideals after their Peace Corps service.
What I take away is that America must always try to put its best foot forward. We will never know the prints it leaves, if it leaves prints, and it does. But we know that we still are trying as human beings to do our best in the world as patriots and as citizens of the world. Sarge taught me that we carried two passports, one grounded in the soil of American democracy, which he served 5 years in the Navy to defend, another as a global citizen. He believed a single person could be as important as any institution, could relieve misery, could nurture minds, could inspire others, and could crack open a little further the gates long shut by ignorance, bigotry, or just sheer misunderstanding. I'll read very quickly. When I was his deputy, he gave me a copy of Podok's book, The Promise, and he highlighted this paragraph. Human beings don't live forever, Reuben. We live less than the time it takes to blink an eye if we measure our lives against eternity. So it may be asked what value there is to human life. There's so much pain in the world. What does it mean to suffer so much if our lives are nothing more than a blink of an eye? I learned a long time ago, Reuben, that a blink of the eye itself is something. The span of life is nothing. But the man or woman who lives that span, they are something. They can fill that tiny span with memory so that its quality is immeasurable. I believe almost every Peace Corps volunteer has discovered that about him or herself, that what they did was immeasurable and unforgettable.
Mr. Moyers, that's a powerful way to end the segment. I will tell you that my own experience there as a volunteer echoes that very briefly. Some of you have heard me say this before. One of my lasting experiences, and when somebody asked me what Peace Corps service is all about, I share often this story of being on an overcrowded bus on my way back into Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic when I got a tap on my shoulder and an older gentleman asking if I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I responded, I was surprised, and how'd he know? And he looked at me like I was crazy, because what else would I possibly be in the back of a crowded bus in the Dominican Republic? But he said, he never asked my name, but he just said thank you. Because when he was a little boy, there was another Peace Corps volunteer that was sent to his village and put in an aqueduct, a clean water pipe, to provide clean water to his community. And he never got a chance as a little child to be able to say thank you. And all of those years later, he just wanted to pass along that gratitude. He never asked my name, never asked where I was from, never asked what I was doing, just wanted to take a moment to credit that individual who I never knew who he or she was all those years before. But that matters. And it still does. And those are stories we carry with us as volunteers that others, so many members of those communities carry with them. And with enormous respect, Mr. Moyers and Mr. Josephson and everybody else that helped conceive of this idea, I don't know if any of you could have possibly imagined what the impact that would have on those communities and that cumulative impact for 250,000 plus volunteers over these past 60 years. And obviously for all of us that had the extraordinary honor to serve. So thank you. Truly grateful to you both for your service and your willingness to join us today and mark this historic moment. And for your continued example, what you set for all of us. It is my honor at this point to turn this part of the program for a couple of minutes here. We'll go for about 10 minutes and a little bit beyond that 10:30 deadline here, if you guys will indulge me, because I really want to have a engaged Marieme Foote, who, as Glenn mentioned, is the returned Peace Corps volunteer from Benin, who came home in March 2020 when COVID forced Peace Corps to suspend their programs. She's pursuing a master's now at Georgetown University and advanced foreign service placement with USAID. But I think we all thought that couldn't be a better person to have this conversation, not just of as we talk about the past and the roots and the foundings of the Peace Corps, but from a volunteer that has experienced this very recently, what this next chapter looks like, the next 60 years, and the actual tangible nature of service in a world that when I would speak to mentors of mine like Senator Chris Dodd, and he talked about the early days of the Peace Corps getting dropped down in the Dominican Republic himself and picked up 2 years later, maybe, how the world has changed when everybody has a smartphone. And so, Marieme, I'm grateful to have you here. Would love just some of your initial reactions here and your idea of what that service is going to look like in the years ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moyers and Mr. Josephson. Hearing your stories of perseverance and hard work and all of the work that went into the creation of the Peace Corps is really inspirational, especially when thinking about, 60 years from now, what we're going to be doing. And so when I think about, the last 60 years of the Peace Corps, obviously I wasn't alive for most of it, but it was created on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement, and so much has changed in those 60 years. My father served in the 70s. And so when I talked to him about his service and even the technology aspect, I had 4G in my site. And he tells me all the time that he had to drive, to the village next door, which was hours away, to place a phone call at a post office. to speak with his parents. And that was maybe 5 times in his service, a handful, whereas like I could stream Netflix in my village. And so a lot has changed over these years. And so when you look at the Peace Corps, and you look at the world around us and these conversations around racial justice, around equity, around class, and how this should affect the Peace Corps, you see that these things are all connected. You know, we have more volunteers that are serving that are coming from diverse backgrounds. We have volunteers coming from who are first generation, you know, whose parents were served by Peace Corps volunteers. My mother was served by Peace Corps volunteers. And so with that, you see also a need for the Peace Corps itself to change. The Peace Corps can't remain the same as it was in the 60s, and that's a good thing. It was created as a radical, you know, beautiful concept, as was spoken before. And this concept of service is continuing on until now. And so we had a report that we did at NPCA in the wintertime that kind of brought out a lot of these really important issues that volunteers today are facing, and some of the really important ways that we can support volunteers to serve and also to better serve our communities. And so when we think about service and aid, so much has changed in 60 years. And the way that we do service, especially with technology, it's changed the game. And so thinking about how we can better work with our communities, how we can better effectively serve, all of these questions are questions that we need to ask ourselves now, and questions that we need to ask ourselves for 60 years from now when we want to see the Peace Corps continue to grow.
Miriam, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I actually think, given the impact that we're seeing with technologies you highlighted, 4G in your site, I didn't even have that when I served in the early 2000s. I had to get on a bus to go into to check email and such, but I was still in more or less consistent contact with my family. They could call out a cell phone that worked. But it creates challenges, obviously, in that constant flow of communication back and forth with family and friends. It also creates enormous opportunities when we're looking at challenges like climate change and the need to actually make local changes and local investments at the hyperlocal level all over the world. But the opportunity then to leapfrog some of these technologies and actually help make a dramatic impact on whether it's the fight on climate or climate resiliency, access to water, electricity, others that we didn't have before, and connectedness. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for the Peace Corps as an organization and institution to start to think, how do we leverage those roles of the opportunities that come with technology? How do you think through opportunities for partnerships when obviously impacts, as COVID as we've seen, impacts around global health are hugely consequential and are going to continue to be? How are ways we can leverage the opportunities of people on the ground in these communities with the backing of the people of the United States to actually make a long-term and sustained impact there? And so I'm actually very excited and bullish about the future. What we need is obviously continue to have volunteers like you that are willing to come back and lean into that message and explain to people why it's still so relevant.
Definitely. And what's really exciting is when I was serving, you know, my village, a lot of people didn't have access to electricity, but solar panels and renewable energy were ways that people were able to get this, to have electricity. And so thinking about, you know, these like leapfrogging past even a lot of the more carbon emission ways of producing electricity into solar panels and other solutions. And so also, like, you know, a lot of volunteers that I know, you know, everyone has WhatsApp. So they're able to continue, you know, these long conversations and continue their work and while they're here in the US. So I know a lot of people who still to this day are working on projects with their communities and raising funds and working with them on creating like educational centers or creating resources for their communities all through the internet. And so finding a way that Peace Corps can kind of work these into the way that it is functioning and like also connect people here in the US with abroad and not having to be physically present is something that and COVID has also given us a chance to kind of explore this new field of Zoom and internet. And internet access is almost everywhere now. It's a growing thing. And so kind of thinking of the ways that we can bring this into our work and this technology and all of this renewable energy and all of this new information is definitely the future. And it's something that's really important that we can bring into our work.
And I'm struck by that, Miriam, and particularly when we talk about the third goal, right? So much of this, even my initial comments were about how technology and the challenges of this moment can actually, Peace Corps can be levered and leveraged to actually make an impact in local communities overseas. But really what this also means is, you can imagine obviously a returned Peace Corps volunteer coming home, engaging in whether it's teaching or an after-school program or in a public school, and all of a sudden being able to create a connection with a community the entire world away by Zoom or by FaceTime, and actually leveraging these connections to further advance that interconnectedness that Peace Corps, I think the experience is so impactful for folks, but oftentimes is difficult to explain. We've all run into that challenge of, you get somebody say, oh, you just came back from the Peace Corps. How was it? As if you could sum up the last 2 years of your life in like 20 seconds. This enables us to actually be able to show those connections and tell that story in a much more powerful way.
Yeah, definitely. My dad, there's a comment in the comment section about aerograms. So my dad tells me about how many letters he had to send. And I don't think I've actually sent a letter in years. And that alone just shows where we are, and the fact that these borders almost don't exist on the internet. We're able to cross borders, we're able to travel hours and hours away and connect with people on a regular basis in the current moment, instead of sending these letters that takes maybe days, months, I don't know, to get to the other person. And so using all of that, the technology to connect, the technology to kind of cross these borders is something that we can use in our work to empower people really, and to give them the information that they need to empower themselves. And it's something that we need to take advantage of, and it's the future.
So I'm going to wrap up this segment of the program with the same question to you that I asked of Mr. Moyers and Mr. Josephson. What, given your experience and given curtailed as it was, but given your time in Benin, your commitment to the ideals that Peace Corps hopes to help ignite in people, and your current educational service and your future service, what does the Peace Corps as an organization and that experience mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, Peace Corps really at its heart, I think this was said, was, service and wanting to serve and wanting to be with people. And I think that finding new ways to bring all Americans and make this experience something that all Americans can do, and something that everyone around the world can partake in, I think is really important, in bridging those connections. And that's really at the heart of, I think, what it is serving other people, connecting with other people, and exchanging ideas, exchanging different concepts and all of that. I think that that's really what's important. And, sharing those life experiences, people to people connection, I think is the best part of Peace Corps. I still talk to my host family. I hope that, they'll be my family forever. And it's built some really beautiful relationships in my life. And I think it's also impacted other people. And so thinking about how we can make the Peace Corps something that we all can do, and something that we all can partake in and celebrate, and bring into also this new generation, and thinking of how, we can make this experience something that is accessible to them, something that's interesting for them, and something that's also a radical concept. And how can we do that? That's really my question going forward.
Miriam, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your service, and excited and grateful for what I think we all have faith in what your next contribution is going to be. I'm grateful to have you here this morning. As we move to conclude here, we have a special presentation. And so I want to introduce the chair of the National Peace Corps Association, Mary Carmen Smith-Martinez, to close out this morning's program. Mary Carmen, over to you.
Thank you, Joe, for moderating such a wonderful panel, and for joining us to celebrate this moment, the official establishment of the Peace Corps with the signing of the Peace Corps Act at the exact moment 60 years ago. And thank you further for all you do to advance the legacy of the Peace Corps, and for your continued service to others, clearly demonstrated in the words that you share and the stories that you share of your work. Further, to Mr. William Josephson, Mr. Bill Moyers, thank you both for being here today, as you were in the beginning, helping to build a program that 60 years later remains a beacon of peace, of understanding, intercultural exchange, and of friendship, as Miriam was saying, the base of so much of Peace Corps experience is relationships, the people that we meet, the people that we serve, and how those relationships impact our lives beyond service and into that third goal experience. Peace Corps wouldn't exist, Mr. Josephson, Mr. Moyers, if it weren't for your efforts and the collaboration of others 60 years ago. And the greatest tribute, no doubt, is the impact of the 240,000 volunteers who have served in every part of the world, an impact that is both immeasurable and unforgettable, to quote the passage Bill Moyers shared with us earlier. And as a symbol of this impact, our collective Peace Corps community would like to offer a small token of appreciation, recognizing your longstanding service to the Peace Corps and to our nation. Given the virtual circumstances of the day, we can't necessarily give these tributes to you in person, but fear not, we are sending them in the mail and look forward to your receipt of these tokens of our appreciation and the symbols that they represent. Thank you for all you have done to establish the Peace Corps and to help us be 60 years later where we are today and setting the stage for those next 60 years. And finally, a message to all our PCs and our PCVs and friends. Thank you for joining us today to mark this historic moment. This concludes our event right now, but there's so much more to come. And we look forward to seeing you in the Peace Corps Connect conference and this celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Peace Corps, which kicks off tomorrow evening and continues through Saturday. So thank you for joining us for this moment. And we look forward to Peace Corps Connect 2021, to the continuing celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Peace Corps, and happy Peace Corps Act Day to all.